Proactive security is all about being proactive. Well, here in Australia, there's a lot of organizations that I've worked through and with on implementing, great security practices, proactive responses to security. And what I've realized as well, as we sort of discuss our proactive security approaches, I can also tell you there's about 3 out of 10 organizations in Australia who are currently proactive and do this extremely well. The other 7 to 10, or the 7 out of the 10, are quite reactive, and that's okay, right? So we're here to educate, we're here to train, we're here to support and grow out those functions to ensure that there are adequate security proactive controls that have been implemented correctly as well. So just a bit of food for thought there. So I guess the next question is, well, how do we become proactive, and where do we begin, and what do we look at? And we don't want to be sitting around waiting for things to happen, right? So we want to, again, alleviate that wait, response, and then react to a certain issue. Well, being proactive is all about foreseeing things, and right, we want to identify these things sooner than obviously later. So what are some common, or what are some good ways to begin doing this? And the very first thing that we've pretty much have discussed already, and that's around threat hunting, right? This is us going out, either our security team, or we've got a third-party service provider that we've probably contracted. The first thing that I would encourage everyone to do is define if you're currently doing any threat hunting, right? And threat hunting, again, is having your own team, and this is us being proactive. It's us going out there, looking for these threats that are reflective to our industry, that are affecting I'm just going to put some points here. So one is our industry profile. We want to define what our industry is in. Maybe there is some sort of threat assessment that we've done, or a criticality assessment. These are all great measures that we can start implementing into our security to understand, well, what are our threats that are potentially coming after us in through our threat assessment, right? We define those threats, we understand the criticality of them through our criticality assessment, essentially, and they sort of go hand in hand together. So define our industry, understand our verticals, understand our threat appetite. What does that look like, right? So we're being proactive against our TTPs, right? So I'm just going to do a TTP here. So our techniques, tactics, and procedures, we define them, and we've used things like the MITRE framework. Again, a threat management sort of framework that we can follow. We can dive into APT groups, understand the motives, understand their attack types, understand the procedures behind them. So I'm going to say here, procedures along with, techniques, tactics, right? Again, tying out to the TTP. So we define what that looks like. We've got our APT groups that are potentially after us, or can potentially cause damage to our industry, cause damages to our reputation in the industry based on the client profiles that we work with, right? And the ultimate thing here is that when we're doing threat hunting, we want to define, or we want to analyze that traffic. And is this traffic abnormal? Yes. So are there abnormalities with our traffic? And this all sort of dives into, is there large amounts of data that's potentially being used through maybe open ports? So if we currently use DNS, right? So I'm pretty sure everyone uses DNS on some level. So DNS is basically, well, we need to define, what the IP address is for a certain domain. So what is the IP address for a certain XYZ domain? Now, DNS is one of the most widely used network services across the internet and the world, and there's a lot of attacks that we can potentially do. Well, anytime we go do a DNS translation for one, so if we're just talking about DNS here as we're sort of discussing this, anytime we go do a DNS or an ARP resolution, and we go, okay, well, what's the layer 2 to layer 3 addressing of the IP address and the MAC address? And if we're talking about DNS and we're doing that resolution from that IP address to the domain name, well, that's very little traffic, right? So the traffic to do that is not going to be gigabytes of traffic. Well, my question is, well, what happens if it's 6 gigabytes of traffic that are going through your DNS protocol? well, is that going to be an issue? And chances are, well, there's some abnormalities happening with that, right? So we're not going to be seeing 6 GB of traffic being maybe tunneled through DNS. So that could be a potential issue. So I would start looking at the first thing that I would be start defining would be, well, are we analyzing our traffic correctly? And are there any abnormalities with those network services that we're currently using across our environment? So once we define the baseline of these, so we've got DNS, then I would have a baseline of our DNS traffic, and maybe it's a few kilobytes. Now, if we start to see a jump in that, and there's like maybe a gigabyte out of a certain location, or maybe 3 GB, then we can start putting in pattern recognitions, right? So this is our next point when we start talking about patterns. Defining those patterns, because patterns are an early indicator of compromise. And if we know what the patterns we're looking for, it's easy for us to be proactive against those sort of attacks, or, obviously putting in preventative controls as well. So let's just say that there's maybe a host on the internal network and it's making a call out to a certain, www server, maybe every 10 minutes on the dot, not a second late, right? It's making all these calls every 10 minutes. 10 minutes goes by, there's another call. 10 minutes go by, there's another call. Well, chances are, if this is occurring every 10 minutes, that there's a web server and that's making a call out session to some sort of web service, well, chances are that's probably an IOC, or maybe that's sort of C2 communication that's happening there. Maybe that host has been infected, and then that malware or that backdoor of some sort is making that call out every 10 minutes to the command and control center of that, that server that's out there that's hosting that information. And then it's basically asking it, well, we're basically checking in with it, right? We're going to be, well, do you want us to run any sort of commands? Do you want us to do anything? And that's how we're going to start defining those. So we define those patterns across our infrastructure, and then from there we can put in controls. So the other thing that we can start looking at as well as we're talking about this is encrypted traffic very quickly, right? So if this scenario is happening with HTTP, and we know that HTTP is using port 80, for example, and then if we're using, if we see encrypted traffic over that port 80, well, then that could potentially be a problem, because we know that HTTPS on port 443 is what uses our encrypted traffic. So again, if we're using encrypted traffic over HTTP, well, then that's going to be an abnormality across the environment. And then we know that could potentially be an issue when HTTP does not respond or does not use that level of encryption. So we can understand and we can create a baseline across the environment to define what the patterns look like, understand the network traffic on that sort, and then from there we can put in our controls. So that's the first part, is us going away and doing threat hunting and defining what the threats are, and then being proactive against, common network services, analyzing our network traffic, and again, defining and looking at our patterns, right? The other component here that I want to sort of touch on is logging, right? And at some form, we're doing some sort of aggregate logging through our environment. If we're using a SIEM platform, which is great for, SIEM is just a security and event information monitoring solution. Information event, sorry, I should say. So it's a security, information, and event monitoring. Basically, here what we're doing is we're ingesting system information, logs, we're analyzing them, we're identifying any abnormalities across the logging infrastructure. So this typically comes into, and we can create baselines, right? We can create a baseline profile that says, well, account creations, right? Are we creating accounts? Who's creating accounts? Are there any changes to the account modifications on some level? For example, it could be account creation, could be one of them. So we're going to be monitoring and looking out for account creations. We're going to be looking out for changes in groups, maybe changes in permissions, right? So we're going to be looking at that. Now, when we're doing these sort of logging, we want to make sure that any time someone is making a change to the environment, well, someone or a people of people are looking at the logging infrastructure, they're going to be looking at our SIEM, and then they can start correlating the events and the information and understanding, well, what's the impact, what's the event, and then obviously triaging it if that is going to be a malicious activity, or if it's maybe a false positive. Again, detailing and defining how your log reviews are currently playing out. So things like PowerShell, right? We all know that PowerShell, we can do an EB bypass, so execution bypass, and then we can launch some sort of PowerShell scripts. Well, chances are, if someone's going to be running this across the environment, maybe the intention is to be malicious. So we can then define what that looks like again. So as an admin, maybe a network admin can go in there and they're doing this. So if we run away and we say, hey guys, who's running PowerShell execution bypass on the network? And then no one responds to that, or someone says, well, we have no idea who's doing that. Well, chances are, again, we'll need to investigate what that is, have those sort of controls in place, define our parameters, and then we can go away and put in the right controls and measures in place. So that's just a bit of an overview around logging, making sure our logging and infrastructure is working, which is the main thing, right? So testing this, we can do threat hunting and threat emulation to test account creations in Active Directory. Maybe it's on a web service or a web host of that sort. And then if we create an account on that, is someone going to be picking up or the backend logging essentially against that web server, for example? So we want to define the abnormal changes and obviously investigate putting in the right controls. Then we'll go away and investigate the process. So threat hunting and logging of activities are two forms of activities that we can start being proactive across our security infrastructure. So let's just talk a little bit about some countermeasures. So this was a question that was raised to me a couple of days ago. And we started defining, well, what are some countermeasures that we can put in place to address certain problems or risks across the infrastructure? Well, let's start defining some typical threats and countermeasures. And this kind of, every time I think about a countermeasure, I kind of think of, walking into, JB Hi-Fi if I want to go buy some headphones or, buy something from there. And there's a security guard that's, standing at the front door, then he's asking me, to look into my bag and make sure that I didn't steal anything. So typically we've got some sort of countermeasure against some sort of problem or a risk. And this could be things like maybe theft, right? So we want to put in the right procedures or the right countermeasures based on, those challenges or those risks to a certain situation or a certain environmental control that we have in our business landscape. So let's talk about some countermeasures in this sense. So the very first countermeasure that I want to sort of mention would probably be a risk could be phishing. So if we're talking about phishing, well, what are some countermeasures with phishing? Well, the first countermeasure that we can think of is education, right? We want to educate our staff, make sure there's adequate training in place. We're doing the proper amounts of, education and practical awareness to the environment of our staff and, certain business units if they're more susceptible to phishing than others, right? So we want to have that education process. And that may look something like having a 5-step process, something like if the users don't know what to do, well, in the sense of a phishing attack, well, that's how they're going to be susceptible to those attacks, right? So they need to have maybe a detailed little plan. And I'm just going to put 5 steps here. And this could look something like, well, if there's a phishing email that comes through, maybe inspect the email. That could be something like, don't click. And if it is suspicious, maybe we'll send that over to IT support. Maybe we have some banners or some flyers around the cubicles, and then there may be further training based on, our information security policy or how things tend to happen with phishing attacks, right? So that's, again, respective to the organization that, how you want to run your own phishing education. But typically you would have a process on how a user will handle or how they will countermeasure a phishing attack and define what that is. The other component here may be ransomware. So if we are susceptible to ransom or a potential component of the business is susceptible to ransomware, not too long ago I was working with a law firm, and a law firm had no centralized management of assets. Quite a lot of the infrastructure was not separated. There's no separation of duties within different departments, and a lot of the holistic network environment was not configured correctly to session out the environment. So basically, you've got everything on a single VLAN, for example, nothing was separated. You had the wireless network being able to talk to the internal corporate environment, which was not a good thing. And, ransomware was a very highly likely component because we would have, let's say there's 30 users within a specific department. I'm just going to put 30 users here. And then you would have maybe 100 USBs coming in from partners or from other firms, and then these 30 users will get one of those USBs, they'll plug them into their laptops, and we don't know the validity of the source of that information, right? It could be that law firm or another partner firm that sent that information. It could be a customer, right? So there was a very, and obviously USBs was one of them. Then you had CDs and you had some other pluggable media that will get sent through. Well, ransomware was a highly potential issue because if we could send something to a user on a USB stick, chances are that they would plug it in. So we had to put in some countermeasures for potential ransomware attacks. Now, not going to talk too much around this, but however, we went through and make sure that there was adequate training implemented into the security controls and obviously best practices with network segmentation, putting in rules to isolate traffic, infected machines, which were potentially being able to happen. So we had obviously we had to go through that approach and define clearly who are the most susceptible users. Maybe not all the 30 users are going to be plugging in things anymore. Maybe it's just one user, or maybe we've got a tiered approach now where no one will plug it in, had to go through maybe an external party. I'm just going to put here external party. Or we had a different shipdig system, right? We had a sort of a test environment that's just separated, and then they've got a bunch of 10 machines in here, and then people can go there, plug them in, and if anything is malicious, then it can run on this separated network, not at all associated to our environment. So again, countermeasures that are reflective to our environment, and then putting in those controls, whether it's network segmentation, whether it's our shapedig system, whether it's, endpoint protection. If there is an unpatched software, what are we doing vulnerability scannings to define them? Part of our patching program as well to define the life cycle of the patches, things like that. So defining what those ransom countermeasures would look like, and I just sort of spoke through a few in just in that moment ago. So more. So what else? There's insider threats, right? How do we know that there's malicious activity with our team members? Someone that's going to be unhappy, that could be a potential threat. Well, how do we identify that? Well, maybe we're going to put in some sort of log analysis. And this is going back to, the countermeasures over here that we spoke about before. So how do we become proactive? Well, our logging and infrastructure. Now, if someone that's in an engineering team is all of a sudden accessing HR information, do we have the ability to monitor that traffic? Why is engineering now accessing HR or another department for some sort, right? So we want to be able to define that traffic and define who is accessing this information. Why do they require it? Again, practicing the least privilege methodology, right? And least privilege is all about giving access that's just enough access to do the job function, nothing more, nothing less. And there's a bunch of different sort of measures that we can put in place. Least privilege is a great form, and it just helps us manage issues like this where insider threats could be a potential reason or a potential risk. Another one with an log analysis we can talk about is our separation of duties. Now, I mentioned before these 30 users down here when the users were plugging in USB devices and you had multiple users having access to a lot of infrastructure requirements which they shouldn't have access to. Now, separation of duties is all about ensuring that one person does not have all that full authority to do 3 or 4 different roles within a specific organization. Now, if it's an accounting firm or if we're doing some sort of accounting payment processes, well, maybe as that process sort of goes out here, maybe there's a 3-step process. And I'm just going to do 1, 2, and 3 just to explain this out a little bit. Maybe the user 1 has access to create. Maybe create the payroll platform, maybe create a new user subscription to begin to maybe pay an invoice. So maybe they have to maybe create some sort of payment process information of some sort, but they don't have access to delete or modify or do any sort of changes, right? So maybe they just have access to create. Person number 2 can do changes, but they cannot create and cannot do anything else. So you're kind of separating out the duties to complete the payments. And then step 3 may be, we're doing the full payment release. So it kind of goes through that tiered process where maybe this level 3 cannot create or change or modify anything. They just have an approve or deny function, and that's it. And then they have to obviously review the information, make sure it's all correct, and then that's all they can do. They can't create, can't modify, and if they do anything like that, it is obviously logged and monitored based on that network traffic. So again, defining that as a potential key risk indicator, understanding the countermeasures to those potential threats. So that's how we can address some sort of insider threat as well as we move on through countermeasures. And the final component here that I want to sort of touch on is our APTs. And APTs, again, highly skilled, great funding behind them, highly sophisticated. Well, the first thing that I would kind of look at here is our network environment. So IPSs, IDSs, making sure they're up to date. We've got the right infrastructure that's supporting these kinds of attacks. We've done our threat hunting. We've identified our threat appetite, how that looks like. I would also go through training as well. Training with maybe our executive teams, maybe with our internal users. So the culture of the business as a whole has to be trained to be prepared for an APT attack of whatever that kind of looks like. I would also go and look into our logging and infrastructure. So kind of touching what we're already talking about, defining our logging and analysis. Are we looking out for those activities in our logging that could be abnormal? We spoke about protocols, spoke about those different services. If there is an abnormality, well, chances are it's going to be a potential risk. So 4 countermeasures for 4 common security threats. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I'm going to dive into another component in the next video, just while we're sort of discussing this, because I think we got a little bit too messy. But as always, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If there's any other questions you'd like to see me answer, please let me know. And as always, see you all in the next video.